Okay, yassas, everybody. How are you doing? Still vibrant after all these lectures. Hopefully you've been as inspired as I am. Especially this morning was really impressive and also touching. I'm gonna give a talk about the insights throughout the years of Intervoice and work of Marius and Sandra into voice hearing and the goals as formulated in the Melbourne Declaration in how far they are achieved and what the challenges are for the future. When I arrived here in Thessaloniki, I was really glad to see all the graffiti. I don't know if you noticed, Thessaloniki is full of graffiti. And this was one of the most beautiful ones I saw there. And in a way, graffiti is like a visual form of hearing voices. You see a message on the wall, you don't know who made it, but it has a meaning, it has a form. And yeah, this to me is a beautiful vision, similar to hearing voices. So who am I? I'm Robin Timmers, I'm a voice hearer. I hear voices since 2001. The first few years I had a difficult time. I could not cope with the voices. I didn't know what was going on. I went into a crisis. On the one hand, you could describe it as a psychosis, but on the other hand, it was like a spiritual crisis for me. After that, I recovered and went on to develop myself as an expert by experience. And I finished my psychology degree, my bachelor degree in psychology. Since 2009, at the first World Congress about Hearing Voices, I learned so much in the international network, and I decided I wanted to put it into practice. So a couple of years ago, we founded the Dutch Hearing Voices Support Center, and it's a group of experts by experience that try to inform and support both the voice hearers, the family and friends of voice hearers, and the mental health care workers in order to promote recovery and emancipation. And together with Sandra, I'm also an editor of the Klankspiegel, which is the Dutch Hearing Voices Network magazine. So I'm going to talk about the insights and the goals from the Hearing Voices Network, but I also want to share some insights from outside the Hearing Voices Network and see how they can complement each other. And in the end, I will try to give an integrated theory of both these different insights. So yeah, the Hearing Voices Network was way ahead of their time. Back in the 80s, they were already working with peer support, with experts by experience, with the idea that you can actually recover, that you can learn to live with voices, which was a new idea back then. Ron Coleman, one of the first generation, one of the first sons, you could say, in the family of Intervoice, he asked the question, recovery, is it an alien concept? Can you recover from schizophrenia? Because back then they thought schizophrenia is a lifelong biologically determined disease, which is not. So I think, the Hearing Voices Network were really pioneers in recovery. And fortunately, at least in the Netherlands, recovery is becoming the new paradigm of trying to help people, you know, in mental health care. And I think actually last week there was the Nobel Prize. Some people found a GPS system in our brain and they get the Nobel Prize. But I really think that Marius and Sandra should get one because of their research, but more so because I think because of their work they gave literally thousands of voice hearers back their lives. Otherwise they would have been still institutionalized, still drugged, with no hope for the future. And I think actually they might have saved hundreds of lives of voice hearers that might otherwise have committed suicide. And they empowered a lot of voice hearers to become experts by experience and make a living by helping people. So I would like to honor Marius and Sandra And if you want to give them a big applause. Really, if it wasn't for them, the world would be different. Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah. So a short history of the Hearing Voices Network. Back in 1987, it started actually by Marius, who had a talk with Patsy Haag. And from things then on, I'm not going to tell the whole history, but that evolved to the Dutch Hearing Voices Network called Weerklank. And in 1997, it became an international network called Intervoice. In 2009, the first World Congress about Hearing Voices was held in Maastricht, and that was the time that I first discovered this great network, this tribe of people. So I don't know if you know the Hearing Voices Declaration of Melbourne from last year, but it summarizes the insights and the dedications that we have in helping people recover, helping them to live with voices, and to help emancipate these experiences. So if you don't know it, please look it up on the internet, and if you're in an organization, please ask your organization to sign this declaration. It's a really good summary of all the insights up till now. In this talk, I will be talking about hearing voices as a common human experience, as a human variation. Like, you can be left-handed, you can be right-handed, you can hear voices, you cannot hear voices. You can be homosexual or you can be heterosexual. All is possible. It's just a variation, it's not a pathology. We're going to talk about the emancipation of the experience of hearing voices, but also the emancipation of beliefs. We're going to talk about the role of trauma, which is really important thing that Marius and Sandra discovered, that a lot of voice hearers had trauma and that the voices talk about these things, about these problems. Gonna talk a little bit about the mapping of the experience, like you can do with the Maastricht interview, and about changing the relationship with the voices. You can change the relationship from being enemies to becoming friends. And that's an important way of recovery. In short, who does the Hearing Voices Network try to influence? Of course, the voice hearers. We want to help them have a life with well-being. Want to inform and help the family and friends of voice hearers, try to influence the mental health care, but also science, that we, like the presentations of this morning, investigate more in a scientific way this experience. But also politics and law, it's a human rights movement. And of course the general public. So, at least in the Netherlands, I don't know how it is in Greece, there's beginning of acceptance that you can actually hear voices and be mentally healthy. 4 to 13% of the general population hears voices, while only 2% has a diagnosis, and only 0.5% has the diagnosis of schizophrenia. So most voice hearers are actually mentally healthy, but they don't talk about it because they might get labeled as being sick, as being crazy. Like we saw earlier this morning, it's not just schizophrenia. From back in the days, psychiatry always said hearing voices is a symptom of psychosis and schizophrenia, but it happens a lot in all kinds of situations. People with dissociative identity disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline, also in Alzheimer and Parkinson. And one interesting thing that's a new insight, people who grow old and start having hearing problems, they start to hear voices. My grandmother has this thing. And interestingly, they start hearing music in the beginning. So my grandmother was the same thing. She started hearing music, and she was asking, why is the neighbor putting this music late at night, you know? So then my uncle went listening, and it was silent. So, oh, I'm hearing something. And yeah, this happens a lot. And this yeah, these different diagnoses give us a hint of the underlying causes, the trauma, but also in hearing problems. It's similar to the sensory deprivation explanation, which I will go into later. So there's the beginning of acceptance that voice hearers can occur among the general population, but psychiatry and science is now saying the general population can have psychotic experiences or symptoms, and what we are trying to say at Intervoice is the other way around. It's a new, normal human variation, because what science and psychiatry is doing in this way is pathologizing a lot of mentally healthy people. So this is, then, I think, the challenge for the coming years, to make it a normal variation. We look, how do you say this? It's like homosexuality. In the first DSM, you know, the Bible of psychiatry with all the diagnoses. In the first DSM, it said homosexuality is a mental disorder. And after a lot of activism, that's now out of the DSM. And that's the same thing we want to do with hearing voices. So, talking about Emancipation, I'm really happy with this song. You know, The Monster by Rihanna and Eminem. It was one of the biggest hits of last year. Over 300 million people watched this at YouTube, and it's been played on the radio all over the world. And they're singing, hey, I'm friends with the monster under my bed. I can get along with the voices in my head. And I think this is a really powerful form of emancipation. This message reached a lot of people. It showed that famous people like Eminem and Rihanna can hear voices, but also it highlights that you can change the relationship with the voices. You can learn to get along with the voices. And I think maybe we need these kind of famous people as a role model to give hope and inspiration. So maybe it's a good idea for Intervoice to give them a reward so we can connect up and people start to know about Intervoice. So, emancipation of voices. Marius and Sandra did important research in the 80s. It was the talk actually of Sandra this morning, healthy versus non-healthy voice hearers. And in Intervoice, there's a lot of people, it's a lot focused on psychiatry. But I would really love to see more healthy voice hearers. There are more healthy voice hearers than people who have problems with it. It would be nice if Intervoice is also a place for them. And throughout history, every culture has known spiritual traditions that gave place to voices and visions. Last year, there were the Maori people and there were Aboriginals. There was a Native American, Indian, who was talking about his experiences. And I'm really interested in those different cultures and spiritual traditions. They've been living with voices for thousands of years, and we can learn a lot from them. And I really think it's good to look through the eyes of an anthropologist, not saying, hey, what you are hearing is a dissociated part of yourself. That's not what you do as an anthropologist. You just look at the experiences, at their thoughts, the way they think and experience. I think that's a good way to look at voice hearers in the Hearing Voices Network as well. Because most mentally healthy voice hearers see it as a spiritual experience, and they have spiritual ways of coping, like for instance meditation or yoga or shamanistic rituals. So, and one really important thing I want to bring across, I think it's the next slide. No. I will come into that later. Another important cause of voice hearing can be drugs. For me, an LSD trip was the trigger for me to start hearing voices in the first place. I had traumatic experiences in my childhood, and through the work of Marius and Sandra, I learned this is an important cause too. But you know, using drugs, especially smoking weed a lot, or using MDMA or cocaine a lot, can lead to voices and visions. And There's been very little attention within the intervoice, but for a lot of voice hearers, this plays a really important role. And I think it's not always a bad role that drugs can play, because it can have therapeutic aids as well. For the first time since the 60s and 70s, there's now again official scientific research into the therapeutic use of drugs. MDMA, for instance, which is the active substance in ecstasy, has therapeutic properties for people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. And also in weed and marijuana, there is a substance which has antipsychotic effects, but also psychotic effects. So they're growing weed now which is high in the antipsychotic effects and low in the psychotic effects. But also in the spiritual traditions, especially in the shamanic traditions, it's been really common to use drugs in their spirituality. So I would really like to see more about this at the Intervoice. Then we go to the emancipation of beliefs. Unfortunately, psychiatry for a long time, if somebody has a spiritual interpretation of their voices, a spiritual meaning to their voices, it's been said, no, you have a delusion or you have lack of insight into your disease. And like in the Melbourne Declaration, it is said, you have the right to hold your own belief. And it's actually a human right, which is in the Human Rights Declaration. Everyone has the right to have their own belief and to change it and share it how they want it. And there's still a lot of emancipation to do here. I know some influential psychiatrists who say spirituality is dangerous. I don't think so. Because like I said, most mentally healthy voice hearers, they have spiritual explanations and spiritual coping strategies. To be honest, within the intervoice circles, I noticed that a lot of people found the explanation of voices as dissociated parts of yourself really attractive. And I think, I can agree with that, but I think we should stay open as well, that if people have a different explanation, that we accept that and respect that. And that we are saying, hey, if you don't understand it like a dissociated part of yourself, then you have lack of insight into your own consciousness. I don't think that's good. So I think we should stay critical within the intervoice as well. Can you follow what I'm saying? Good. This is what I've been saying before. Actually, there's been a distinction. Science have always tried to explain voices as coming from inside your own brain, your own consciousness, while spiritual traditions and most voice hearers say it can come from outside. And it's a metaphysical question. So that's what I was saying earlier on about the new declaration. There's a difference in owning the experience or owning the voices. I think owning the experience is always good. Owning the voices, it's a choice of the voice hearer, whether they see it as something of themselves or not. An interesting development I highlighted last Friday as well is that there's new cognitive behavioral therapy where people can keep their beliefs. Jinns are spirits in the Islamic world, and all Muslims believe them to be real, just like humans. Equally real. So millions, maybe billions of Muslims believe in the reality of jinns. So this way the DSM and psychiatry cannot say it's a a delusion, because it's shared by so many people. So they made a new CBT in which people don't necessarily have to change their beliefs. So this is interesting, I think. This is what I was saying. It's in the Universal Declaration of Rights to have your own belief and to share it or to keep it whenever you want. Another important human rights development that most people don't know about is that there was a new declaration or a convention on the rights of people with a disability. And it's basically saying if you have a disability or no disability, you have the same rights. So if you're in a wheelchair or you have a psychiatric diagnosis, it doesn't matter. You have the same rights as everybody else. But in psychiatry, these rights are violated so much with forced treatments, with isolation cells, with forced medication. I experienced all this myself. Okay, I gotta be fast. All right. But the good news is in 2013, all force in psychiatry has been officially been forbidden as against human rights by the UN. I think I'm gonna, the mapping of experience, I know this is happening a lot nowadays in any specialized treatment of voices. They map it in some way or the other, not as complete as in the Maastricht interview, but it's becoming a normal thing, even though in the treatment as usual, I don't think talking about voices is the normal thing to do yet. Now trauma is an important cause of voices. Things that Marius and Sandra discovered in the 80s has been now really established with big meta studies, scientific research. So yeah, that's now really established scientifically, even though within the mental health care we have a long way to go for instance, trauma therapy to become available for people with the diagnosis of psychosis or schizophrenia. I'll skip this one. I talked about this earlier on. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship with the voices. There's been a lot of talking about that within Intervoice, changing the relationship with the voices from a negative one to a positive one. You can do this yourself by inner dialogue. You can get help from others using voice dialogue. And I would like to show this way of mapping. It's a way that I'm going to use it at the Hearing Voices Support Center. It's Timothy Leary's rose, and it says here, over there is the dominant and submissive axis, and against and together axis. And you can place the voice somewhere here most of the time when people have problems with it. It can be dominating voices and you can feel like you're the victim of it. But the ideal situation is that you are together, that you're friends and helping each other. And this is a nice way, I think, to map voices and your own position. So this, you can use. And together approach. So if you start being friendly to voices, the chances are that the voices are becoming friendly for you. It's like in the 50 Stories of Recovery, the story of Antje Muller. But this is also what was Timothy Leary saying in the 60s. But I think really, really important thing is also changing the relationship with yourself. I think that's what recovery is about for any kind of recovery, to become your own best friend, to help yourself in times of need, to get a positive self-opinion, to take good care of yourself and reassure yourself if you're afraid, and to have fun with yourself. So maybe it's a good idea now to put that into practice and give ourselves a hug. You feel like giving yourself a hug? Yeah. Becoming your own best friend? Yeah. For me, this has been really important, and I noticed when I became my own best friend, the voices started being really nice to me. There's a positive DSM nowadays. I suggest you check it out, but I really want to go to the last part. I will try to summarize it in this slide. You know, when people talk, when people read, and when people write, they use the left part of the brain. That's where the speech centers are. That's where the language centers are. That part of the brain is more related to positive emotions, to things that are familiar. The things that you can put into words and categorize, that you can think rationally about, that's being processed in the left brain. It's more top-down processing. You can control it. For instance, your right hand, if you're right-handed, you can control your right hand. But your left hand, which is directed with the right part of your brain, you have less control over it. It's more bottom-up information, more related to negative emotions and to non-verbal information. The interesting thing is that people who hear voices Actually, well, I just summarized over here. There, the language areas become active in the right part of the brain, which are normally silent. This can explain why people think like, hey, where's this voice coming from? When it's coming from the left brain, you know what it is and you can control it. But when the right brain starts talking, yeah, who or what is this? So it's very much similar like the Julian Jaynes theory back in the 70s, but it's been, how do you call it? Shown into neuroimaging research that this is the case. And also that the auditory parts of the brain really become active when people hear voices. So it's really saying, if you hear a voice, you have an auditory experience. It's a real auditory experience. So these are the last slide that I want to say. I think, you know, biology is not our enemy or something. We are opposing the medical model, the biological medical model, but I think we can complement the different theories, like for instance, Romme and Escher's theory, and that voices are related to unresolved traumas, and that talking about trauma and voices really helps. You can combine it with the things I just told you about the brain, and also that language-oriented coping is really efficient in that voices become silent. If you talk a lot with people, if you read a lot, if you listen a lot to other people talking, you hear less voices. That's the experience of most voice hearers. And also in sensory deprivation and social isolation, if you don't talk to anyone for a couple of months, you know, because there's no input from the outside, the brain starts making voices on the inside. And I think you can combine this. Maybe it's good to get the brain again. So this right brain, if you don't talk about trauma, if you don't talk about your voices, it never reaches the left brain. If you don't want to think about it, or you cannot think about it, if you try to put it away from your consciousness, the right brain offers a big space to put all those unresolved traumas. But if this happens too long, and when the emotional intensity is too big, it can activate the right brain areas leading to voices. So I hope you understand this integration, yeah? So I think these different findings from different parts, Marius and Romme's research and also the brain imaging research, they really can complement each other. And I think it's time now.
Thank you, Robin.
Any questions?
Any questions you have? Έχετε κάποιες απορίες, ερωτήσεις? Σίγουρα? Οκ.
Okay.
Σε ευχαριστούμε, Ρόμιν. Μπορείς να κάτσεις.